Good afternoon. We have made the decision to raise the key rate by 25 basis points to 6.75% per annum, and we hold open the prospect of further rises at the upcoming meetings. Today's decision is based on the following. First, the economy is returning to a balanced growth path. Although the pandemic persists, economic activity bounced back to its pre-pandemic levels already in the second quarter of 2021. Moreover, excluding the oil sector, where production is still limited due to the OPEC Plus agreement, output in the economy has not only recovered, but returned to the trend, to the growth path observed before the outbreak of the pandemic. Employment has restored almost completely. According to July data, the unemployment rate is close to its record lows. In other words, a further development of the economy and output growth will predominantly depend on the growth rate of labor productivity. According to the Bank of Russia's estimate, taking into account the structural measures implemented by the government, the pace of such balanced or potential GDP growth, which is the same, will equal from 2% to 3% annually. Of course, the development of the economy is uneven. The pandemic caused significant changes in the work and everyday life of both households and businesses. As the economy continues to adjust to these changes, the situation is still uneven across different sectors. In addition to the above-mentioned oil industry, passenger transportation and international travel still remain below pre-pandemic levels as well. When restrictions were toughened, public catering and entertainment companies faced a decline in the demand for their services. Nonetheless, a lot of industries are demonstrating steadily higher output and sales than before the outbreak of the pandemic. Specifically, there has been a surge in the demand for durable goods, computers, telecom devices, household appliances, and online trade and delivery services. The lockdown period boosted the demand for countryside housing and better housing conditions in general. These uneven trends across both industries and regions are also described in the Regional Economy Report released by our regional branches before the quiet period. The situation in the labor market also evidences that the economy has not only recovered, but is generally returning to its pre-pandemic growth path. The number of vacant jobs is at its peak. High demand for labor resources is demonstrated by companies in construction and transport, a whole range of manufacturing enterprises, and in trade. These are the industries that started to bounce back earlier and were recovering faster and where demand exceeds pre-pandemic levels. A further expansion of output is possible through a restoration of the inflow of labor migrants, but first of all, through an increase in labor productivity. This all means that after the rebound of the economy completes, it will develop more smoothly at a more gradual pace as compared to the recovery growth of output observed over the last 12 months. In a situation when companies experience a shortage of workers and components, monetary policy measures promoting demand will not increase output or consumption. For instance, if the demand for cars rises even more, this will not boost their output when there are no parts, but will only increase the queues for them and speed up price growth. As regards inflation, it is above the forecast rate, and inflation expectations remain high. In August, annual inflation was 6.7%. According to the steady indicators of inflation measuring the inflation rate without volatile components, inflationary pressure continued to considerably exceed our target in both August and early September. Indeed, inflation is impacted by multiple factors that do not depend on our monetary policy. The most important of them are world commodity prices, the country's fruit and vegetable harvest, bottlenecks in the global supply chains, container shipments, micro-circuit manufacture, etc. It has been stated recently that these factors should be completely ignored if monetary policy cannot influence them. This opinion leaves out one essential circumstance, namely the fact that all these factors impact inflation expectations, which, in turn, influence consumers' sentiment and behavior. Hence, they drive inflation across a wide range of products. Higher inflation expectations boost demand and increase the extent of the pass-through of higher costs to consumers. As a result, companies have the opportunity to almost completely pass costs to prices and thereby maintain or even increase their profits, which in turn discourages them to take efforts in order to reduce costs and improve labor productivity. Monetary policy should prevent the inflationary spiral from getting out of control. Therefore, it should respond to transitory factors to the extent they transform into steady factors through higher inflation expectations. This is especially relevant when households' inflation expectations and companies' price expectations are at their peaks recorded over several years, as they are now. Third, monetary conditions are adjusting to key rate increases faster. Over the period after our July meeting, the yield curve of federal government bonds with maturities of up to 3 years has risen. Furthermore, yields on long-term government bonds remain almost unchanged since last March, when we started to raise the key rate. I would like to remind you once again that the stability of long-term interest rates is crucial for the stability of bank rates on investment loans and mortgages. Interest rates on the deposit market were growing in July-August. The demand for bank deposits started to edge up. As of the end of July, the outflow of funds from retail time deposits ended for the first time since the beginning of last year. Moreover, it even reversed to a slight inflow in August, according to recent data. Our today's decision on the key rate will support this trend, increasing the attractiveness of deposits and the propensity to save. Lending still continues to expand at a fast pace. In July, the annual growth rate in corporate lending remained close to its 6-year high. Growth in mortgage lending has slowed down somewhat after the conditions of the subsidized program were changed, but it is still close to its peaks as well annually. Unsecured consumer lending remains a matter of our great concern, as annual growth rates in this segment continue to rise still, including due to the base effects. If the current trends persist, we admit the possibility of additional macroprudential measures to cool down this segment of the credit market, besides those provided for in the beginning of October. Monetary conditions continue to adjust to our decisions. At our next meetings, we will consider changes in interest rates and in credit and deposit activity and assess whether these changes are sufficient in order to create such monetary conditions that would help bring inflation back to 4% and stabilize it at this level. As regards the risks to the forecast, their balance is still significantly shifted towards pro-inflationary ones. The key demand-side risk is persistently elevated inflation expectations, fueled by, among other factors, the still high inflationary pressure in the global economy. Another important risk is that deposit and credit rates are adjusting to the changes in the key rate more slowly than we expect. That is, the transmission of our decisions to monetary conditions takes more time. As to supply-side risks, logistics problem and bottlenecks in production chains remain a significant risk, as these issues may persist longer than we estimate today. The above-mentioned problem of a limited availability of labor resources is another risk which is becoming increasingly important. Moreover, this problem may become even more serious. This is equally relevant for both the Russian labor market and the constraints experienced by other economies. A decline in global demand due to a slowdown in the world economy may become a disinflationary risk. This may happen, for instance, in the case of a large-scale new wave of the pandemic, accompanied by extensive lockdowns in the majority of countries. In other scenario, where inflationary pressure might also weaken faster in the Russian economy, is a quick easing of the restrictions on foreign travel for both outbound tourism as well as the inflow of labor migrants. There is a number of factors, the potential impact of which is uncertain today. In the first place, these are the volumes and quality of the grain and vegetable harvest this year, both in Russia and worldwide. Moreover, it is still uncertain how steady global inflation is and how fast and extensive other central banks will respond to it. Winding up, I would like to comment on our future activities. We hold open the prospect of further key rate rises at the upcoming meetings. We will assess whether it is reasonable to increase the key rate as well as how long the key rate should be maintained at the level achieved, taking into account economic developments, inflation trends, and largely the balance of risks to future inflation, including those associated with persistently elevated inflation expectations. In addition to the baseline scenario, we also consider various other scenarios of potential developments in the Russian and global economies. The three scenarios describing the key possible circumstances in the external environment were released last week in the monetary policy guidelines for the next 3 years. Monetary policy will be able to bring inflation back to the target regardless of whether the baseline or an alternative scenario materializes. Thank you all for your attention, and now I'm ready to answer your questions. Elena Fabrichnaya, Reuters. The central bank slightly has adjusted its signals. Has it become tougher or softer, or does it mean that the probability of a certain pause, a break, is stronger now over the next board meetings? Well, I would describe it this way, that there does exist an uncertainty with regard to many drivers, which I've identified, including the speed with which the monetary conditions and the deposit rates adjust to the already made decisions with respect to the key rate. This is not only today's decision. These are all of the decisions that we have been making since March in terms of what will happen to the inflationary expectations and how and in what way the consumer savings trends may alter. So we believe that we can now follow in a standard way, watch over the way the whole environment evolves, and as needed, make a decision. At the same time, in our press release, we indeed have put out a signal, meaning to say that if the situation may develop in such a way so that in order to bring the inflation back to the 4% mark, there might be the need not only for one rise of the key rate. And so in this sense, one may say, yes, the signal is a bit tougher. Next question comes from Anastasia Saprikina from RIA Novosti. The central bank today has announced that the inflation is above the forecast. Does this mean that there is a need to further specify this forecast, if positive, up to which level, and the GDP rate growth, wouldn't they require being made more specific in the backdrop of the economy slowing down through the third quarter? We will further update our forecast in terms of the inflation GDP in October during our core meeting. It is true that we do see that the inflation is currently above the forecast, but one should also admit that in August and September, this data is a bit phased by the seasonal factor because time is needed in order to assess situation precisely. In terms of specifying the GDP rate growth, we will also take a look, but once we start doing it, that will be to bring our expectations upwards in terms of the high GDP. Next question from Anastasia Savelieva, Interfax. Yes, good afternoon. Have you already considered what kind of an impact upon inflation, how many percentage points could be added to inflation with regard to the Social Security payments and pensions that were done in September? Should one respond to such through the monetary policy measures? And is there a high probability that the annual inflation in the end of the 2021 will be above your July forecast, which is 5.7 to 6.2%? Another question I have, what's your attitude towards the Minister of Economic Development proposals to step out of the boundaries of the limits of the National Welfare Fund financing? Could it be just the inclusion for this particular project, or it may cover all of the project which have a lot of imported equipment component? And does this not create a precedent or risks for the economy and the monetary policy? And generally speaking, the risks whereby the previous promises made would be turned back? Well, first off, with regard to the Social Security payments, what I would like to specifically draw your attention is that the payments done by the government offered support to those who particularly was in need of this support. And these payments were made possible due to a faster economic recovery and an emergence of an additional non-gas and oil-related revenues. Now, about whether it might impact the macroeconomics and our inflation forecast. Well, the fact of the matter is that using additional non-gas and oil income to cover additional expenditures is an inextricable part of the fiscal rule, and that doesn't create an additional pro-inflationary pressure on the side of the budget policy compared to when these additional revenues, non-oil and gas revenues, are not available. Therefore, and basically we have taken this fiscal rule into account during the previous forecast exercise. In the meantime, and unless it was not clear where these additional non-oil and gas revenues are going to be applied, but this rule that the additional non-oil and gas revenues are going to be taken into account. So from this viewpoint, there are no changes in our fiscal policy that are necessary, and there are no risks that are being created from this point of view. On the contrary, in 2021 compared to 2020, the fiscal policy has been getting back to normal, and the budget deficit, the general and oil and gas one, has considerably shrunk. So, and as far as this part is concerned, the budget contribution to inflation, this year in 2021 compared to 2020, I would say it would be more proper and appropriate to say that it has been disinflationary in its nature. Now, in as far as the limitations of project financing is concerned, above a certain threshold that is currently being debated with respect to Ust-Luga and similar projects, yes, quite so. If the funding is being used to procure imported equipment, that won't impact the exchange rate, and we believe that it won't impact the basic drivers which affect the monetary policy. We don't ascertain any risks here, but without doubt that is the government discretion in terms of which projects should stand as recipients of its investments. So what we come out of is that it would be most effective to invest these resources into the projects which strengthen the potential for the economic growth rate and facilitate the structural recovery of the economy. Thank you. Next question, Kalina Anna from Izvestia. What are other options that have been debated today for the key rate increases? Have you discussed it, possibly to maintain it and sustain it at 6.5%? Yes, indeed. We considered three options: keeping the rate as is, then raising it by by 25 basis points, by 50 basis points, but the core discussion was basically in between the step of raising it either for 25 or 50 basis points. Next question comes from Andrei Birykov, Bloomberg. Good afternoon. You said that it is possible that the key rate may be risen not once. Is there any preliminary forecast peak to which the rate may go up to what extent it may go beyond the 6%? We're not forecasting any possible peaks, and we are fine-tuning our monetary policy in such a way so as to achieve our outcome and bring back the inflation to the stable 4%. Now then, the fact that the situation may evolve in such a way that there might be a need to raise the key rate and more than once, we signaled that, which means that the key rate may be above 7%. Evgeny Belykov from Komsomolskaya Pravda. The program for the exemptions and subsidized family mortgage has been extended and expanded. In this view, how should we assess the potential growth for the real estate prices? Well, I would rather say that they haven't been extended or strengthened, but rather transformed, because the subsidized mortgage has been suspended, while the family mortgage has been further strengthened, and that means that such programs become more customer-centric, more consumer bespoke, and that really makes sense. Now, in terms of what may happen to the real estate prices, what we act upon is that such a transformation of a subsidized mortgage program will lead to the real estate price dynamics slowing down, and that is what must happen. It is an important deliverable in order for the availability of housing could be broadened. I mean, for the people who go for a mortgage loan to buy housing. Dmitry Butrin from Kommersant. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I've got two questions. My first question, considering the statement made by the Bank of Russia, what comes to my mind is an idea that it really doesn't matter much to the Bank of Russia from the inflationary point of view what will happen further to the pandemic, because of course we don't want to see a new wave, because the lack of a new wave might reduce the inflationary pressure, because at least if it doesn't happen, then the outbound travel will resume. But to what extent these risks are symmetric? How comparable the impact from a potential new wave of the pandemic with the opening of the market? I mean, in case it doesn't happen. That is my first question. My second question, the statement by the Bank of Russia speaks a lot about the corporate profits, which come out of, amongst other things, the growth of the inflationary expectations. I mean, the short-term consequences are clear in terms of the monetary policy, but longer-term, how these profits may alter the potential for the GDP growth further on within the next 5 years. As regards the influence over inflation from a possible pandemic becoming stronger, yes, we have considered this particular way of things in our main guidelines. We reviewed the pandemic scenario, which was one of the alternatives. But if, the way it may happen, it definitely will determine the impact it will create upon inflation. Let me remind you that back in the beginning of 2020, we used to expect that there would be a disinflationary effect from the pandemic wave. But during the second wave, it didn't happen. On the contrary, against this backdrop, the inflation spiraled. And altogether, if we look into the risks and which way they might go, these risks are symmetric. Now, with regard to the corporate profits, it's a very good question about the way the corporate profits growth, and we do see that the financial performance surplus is bigger, and that really will depend upon how those profits are used. If there are the necessary conditions in place and the necessary stimulus in place, if there is trust towards the development of the economic policy, and if these profits are invested into new production, into new technologies, into labor productivity improvements, that would undoubtedly positively impact the potential economic growth rates. So the corporate profits is indeed a kind of a resource for the future development, and so it is very necessary to create the necessary conditions so that these profits will be conducive to the stable economic growth rate. Rita Schmileski from TASS, good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon, dear colleagues, and Elvira Nabiullina. I've got two questions. My first one, Sberbank recently has announced its estimates of the extent to which the Russian economy may suffer in terms of the spending on decarbonization until 2050 without the ESG transformation. I would like to find out whether the central bank did any sort of a similar exercise and a possible influence from this process upon the monetary policy. Also, we're talking about the long-term stress test. Maybe the central bank has completed this particular work. And my second question, is the regulator watching over the Wildberries company situation? You definitely seeing what is taking place with the payment system and retailers, so I would be keen to find out what to think about it. With regard to the potential investments into the ESG transformation and the economic development because of the energy transition and the decarbonization, definitely it is impossible to quote any precise figures, but one thing is standing out quite clear, that will require a large amount of investments and some serious transformation efforts. There are so many uncertainties here, including the ones in the technology area, the technologies which may support such a transformation, the scalability of such technology, because currently different international entities come up with the different scenarios. We actively collaborate with the central bank and supervisory entity communities to improve the environmental nature of the financial system, and in our stress tests we also use the kind of approaches that are being produced by this community, as well as use other kinds of methodologies. And on a regular basis, we're going to run such stress testing long term, like we've mentioned, and short term, because we also did one to see how the economics and the financial system may be impacted by the carbon tax system. So we did a sort of a snap kind of a stress test, because that would definitely affect the economy and the monetary policy upon the way the financial system operates. And these stress tests are the ones that would exactly help us to assess the trending and the level at which or to which such transformation may impact the whole economy. Yes, so the stress testing until 2050, we'll definitely start doing it as soon as the results are in our hands, and we will inform you about it. Now, what regards the payment systems, yes, of course, we know what is going on, but in our mind, this is a contract between the entities, and so there's no reason for the regulators to intervene. Next question comes from Gennady Isakov, the Dalnegorsk Evening newspaper. Why the Bank of Russia, in its communications about inflation, is paying more attention about the products rather than the rest of the components making up the consumer basket, including the gasoline? Thank you very much for this question. Yes, indeed, when we describe inflation, in our analysis, we use different indicators. We separately look into various group assortments. We are looking at the indicators which exclude volatile components or one-off factors. But you're quite right. In communications, we're paying larger attention to the price growth, to the inflation dynamics with respect to the consumer goods. But first and foremost, it is because there has been a very a strong price spike in many product groups, but that is definitely something that households are quite sensitive to. Although you mentioned gasoline, and this is also one of the indicators because the gasoline price dynamics very significantly impacts the inflationary expectations, similarly like the utility tariffs. But thank you very much for your questions. We will definitely think about it, and we'll pay more attention not only to the consumer product inflation, but also we will look up to other components making up the inflationary dynamics. Anna Kaledina from Izvestia. Some analysts believe that it is 7% that may become the threshold of the key rate rises. And next year, the central bank may even start to reduce the rate. How realistic is this? Well, I've already said it, that we act on the assumption that we may need not just one, but several key rate rises in order to bring the inflation back to our 4% target. And here, we still have to face a lot of uncertainties. For example, I've mentioned the level of stable inflationary pressure, the speed with which the monetary terms and conditions adjust themselves to our decisions and the inflation expectation dynamics. So it is a bit premature just now to say that the key rate hike so far made would be good enough in order for the inflation to come back to its target. So there might be a need for several rises, but when the central bank may start to lower the rates, it is really too early to say. Next question comes from Ivan Schliegen, Formac.ru. Elvira Nabiullina, good afternoon. I've got two quick questions about the two-digit key rate. Is it possible, or is it a completely outdated instrument, and so the two-digit, double-digit key rate will not be necessary for this economy? And also, second question, September in the West is traditionally believed to be a very difficult month in the year's exchange. Should one in Russia expect September also to be a difficult month, or this is a bit of a financial prejudices and we shouldn't really mind them? Thank you very much for your questions. I don't see the kind of a scenario in the foreseeable future which may require a double-digit key rate. No, we are not considering such scenarios. Now, as far as the stock market situation is concerned, you correctly said it that there are indeed certain prejudices. I mean, there aren't any objective reasons for us to expect any, strong fluctuations in the Russian stock market. It is quite stable and it is developing, and the investors are demonstrating sustainable interest. The IPOs are happening one by one, so everything is in quite a balanced way. Next question comes from Pavel Kazanovsky from RBK. The presidents of Russia and Belarus agreed on harmonizing the monetary policy between the two countries. What are going to be the indicators that the joint monetary policy between Russia and Belarus will entail? Within which period of time this mechanism may become effective? And to what extent this kind of policy will be effective without a single currency in place? Now, as far as the single currency is concerned, I think it's premature to talk about it. And the President of Russia mentioned it. And the harmonization of monetary policies between the two countries, yes, we are debating it with the Belarusian Central Bank, and we are paying attention to what are the areas within which our monetary policies may be harmonized. So what we are thinking that longer term, the Belarusian Central Bank may also start targeting inflation. Now, the time frame will depend upon many factors, but what's important is that we're going to work together towards this outcome. And in our mind, this policy harmonizes the terms and conditions for the businesses, even without a single currency being there. And such a harmonization of monetary policies aims at creating a much more predictable and comprehensible conditions for the economic relations between the companies and entities of our two countries. Next question comes from Tatiana Chubasova, Interfax. Good afternoon. Yes, good afternoon. My question is about your statement where you said that the central bank remains concerned with the rate of growth of uncollateralized lending, unsecured lending. This week, this is also the concern that was voiced by Maxim Merezhkin, the Minister for Economic Development. And so with that in mind, I've got a question. Are there any additional macroprudential instruments that the central bank is considering in order to deter the growth of the unsecured lending spree without raising the risk ratios, apart from the fact that the draft law to hold back the speed with which the consumer loans grow hasn't yet been considered by the Russian parliament. The second question was about the divestiture from the Discovery Bank sales. Could you explain, because currently in media, and there's a bit of a speculation circulating in throughout the market, what kind of potential strategic buyer the central bank is considering? Do you fully exclude any government or pseudo-government structures that might come in, or that the government capital share in this bank is something that you may stay content with? So what is, in your mind, the ideal strategic investor for the Discovery Bank? So is there any interested party? Because we know that in October the applications are going to be submitted, but maybe there are certain considerations that you can share with us. Thank you very much. About the unsecured consumer lending. Yes, we do have certain concerns, and this is not the first time I'm mentioning it, that so far the macroprudential markups have been raised as of the 1st of July, and that shows that the dynamics in the unsecured consumer lending market is something that raises our concerns. Amongst other things, we have envisaged the second step in this area, another increase of the macroeconomic markups in 3 months after the first one happened. So we will closely monitor the developments. What we see right now is that the annual rates haven't gone down, but month on month there is a bit of a stabilization of this rate, even a certain decline. Well, clearly, as far as annualized performance is concerned, they're very much impacted by the base, but nevertheless the rates of growth remain quite high. And we will be ready to consider yet another application of macroprudential measures by increasing the risk ratios, although in my mind their efficiency is there, but it is quite limited when inside the banking system generally there is a bit of a capital reserve, and when it is not evenly distributed. That is why we are actively initiating and working actively in order for the law to be enacted, which would provide us with more effective instruments in order to limit the risks within this very important lending segment. Because if the law is not passed, then we will resort to the tool set that we have, although, as I've mentioned, their effectiveness is limited. Now, as far as the Discovery, the Equity Bank is concerned, the Discovery Bank we intend to divest from. You see it, and we're currently analyzing the interest on the part of strategic investors. Alongside with that, by way of the major way to do it is IPO. Now, what is an ideal strategic investor? We've described what we think about it more than once, and we would like, for when the Discovery is divested from, the share, the government share in the banking industry should be reduced. Next question comes from Ekaterina Litova from Vedomosti. The Bank of Russia has adopted the new provision about the mandatory reserves, which calls, as of October, to re-estimate or on the basis of the reporting of the banks of the first of every month instead of the estimations for every day. Don't believe that that may lead to the abuse when the banks may minimize their residual capital, and that might produce a negative impact upon the bank's pricing policy. Well, these kinds of concerns have been expressed by one of our banks. We have, in response, analyzed the arguments voiced. Definitely we're going to be watching over the banks changing their behaviors, and if necessary, we will further specify the mechanism of calculating compulsory reserves. But this attempt to manipulate the reserves within one day is a very laborious exercise, and that would involve customers into the kind of transactions that the customers may be willing to, take their money to a different bank as the result of it. But we will monitor it further. We are ready to discuss this with the banks, but overall we believe this particular trend is correct because for a majority of the banks it reduces considerably the regulatory burden. Rita Szpilewska from TAS Agency. In July, you were saying that the central bank expects that the product price in the core basket is going to go down. Is the strain remaining, and within which period of the fourth quarter the inflation may start slowing down? Well, in as far as the core product basket is concerned, and generally in as far as the vegetables and fruits are concerned, during the spring period, we witnessed a very fast price growth with respect to the fruits and vegetables, faster than in a normal annual season. And we were able to see that towards the end of summer, this core basket demonstrated its faster and earlier price decline. So that was why we had the expectations that overall the vegetable and fruit price dynamics in many ways compensates for the price growth which occurred earlier. But towards the end of August, this trend slowed. But in as far as the vegetables and fruits are concerned, generally we know that the time frame for the crop harvesting has shifted itself, and so it's a bit early to conclude what will further happen to the prices for the core baskets and whether the prices for these products may further go down. So we will be considering that, because this is one of the uncertainties which may affect the 2021 annual inflation. So we expect that the inflation will contract in Q4, that it will slow down in Q4, but we're not forecasting within which exact month that may happen, because we do see the trends for it. That would be the time factors exhausting their effect, as well as the base effect, and certainly our monetary policy is influencing within the decisions that we were making since March. Alexander Spirichev, Vologda newspaper. The central bank raises the rate and limiting the demand. Is there any category of population or economic stakeholders which win from the key rate growing? We are raising the key rate in order to reduce inflation. From the low inflation, practically all the household categories benefit. Additionally, higher rates will support the attraction of the bank deposits. It will help those who want to save money for tomorrow. Well, that was the last question. I thank everybody for their attention and wishing you all good day.